When Detective Graham knocked on my door at 7:43 in the morning, I was already awake. I'd been awake for hours, actually, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, watching the first light come up over the water and thinking about what came next. The Gold Coast does this thing in early morning, where everything turns this particular shade of pale gold before the sun properly rises, like the whole city is holding its breath. I'd watched that light spread across my balcony railing and thought, today is the day everything changes. I heard the knock, and I already knew who it was going to be. Not because I'm psychic, but because I'd been waiting for exactly this kind of knock for 3 weeks. I took one slow breath, set down my cold coffee, and walked to the door. Detective Graham was a stocky man in his early 50s with a Queensland police lanyard, and the particular expression of someone who has delivered uncomfortable news so many times that his face has settled into a permanent state of careful neutrality. He held up his badge, introduced himself, apologized for the early hour. Then he held up a photograph printed on standard copy paper, slightly grainy from the printer, but clear enough. Crystal clear, actually, because I had specifically purchased the highest resolution motion sensor camera available. The photo showed a man standing in my backyard at 2:17 a.m. The timestamp was printed in white digits in the bottom right corner. The motion sensor light I'd installed 3 weeks earlier had caught him perfectly. Full illumination, face forward, shoulders tense, phone in hand. "Do you know this man?" Detective Graham asked. "He was in your backyard all night." I looked at the photo for a long moment, not because I needed to identify him. I'd known exactly who it was the moment the notification pinged on my phone at 2:17 that morning. I looked at the photo for a moment because I wanted to feel the weight of what I was holding. 47 days of careful preparation, 89 days of the most demanding performance of my life. All of it had been building toward this grainy photograph and this question. "Yes," I said, "I know him. His name is Colin Marsh. He's my fiancé's business partner." Detective Graham nodded and wrote something in his notebook. He asked me a few more questions. I answered them honestly and precisely, the way I answer questions in business meetings, the way I'd been trained to speak when accuracy matters and imprecision costs you money. Then I thanked him for coming, closed the door, walked back to my kitchen table, and allowed myself to smile for the first time in 89 days. My plan had worked, every single part of it. Let me tell you how we got here, because the story doesn't start with a detective at my door. It starts 14 months earlier, on a restaurant balcony overlooking Surfer's Paradise, with a man on one knee and a ring that cost $8,700. I know the exact price because Marcus showed me the receipt. At the time, I remember thinking it was an unusual gesture, sweet in a slightly awkward way, like he was worried I wouldn't believe the ring was genuine unless he had documentation. He was beaming when he showed it to me, so proud, his whole face lit up with the satisfaction of having done something right, having spent the correct amount, having made the correct gesture. I took the receipt from him and looked at the number and handed it back and said, "Yes, of course, yes." And I kissed him, and we ordered champagne and watched the lights ripple on the water, and I thought, this is the beginning of something real. Marcus Alexander was, by every visible measure, exactly the kind of man you'd want to build a life with. 34 years old, successful in Gold Coast property development at a time when the market was moving fast and smart people were getting wealthy. He was tall and certain in the way that men become when they've made enough money that the world mostly does what they want. He was funny in groups, attentive on dates, generous in ways that were calibrated to be noticed. He had good taste in restaurants, remembered details about your life that made you feel seen, and when he looked at you in public, he made you feel like the most important person in any room. I was 28 when he proposed. I'd been running my own consulting firm for 3 years, working primarily with small and mid-sized developers on project feasibility and stakeholder communication. I'd closed $3 million in contracts the year before the proposal. I had a small but solid client list, a reputation I'd built through work that was genuinely good, and the particular quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can take care of yourself in any circumstance. Marcus loved that about me at first. He introduced me to his colleagues as my brilliant fiancée who runs her own consulting firm. He asked my opinion about projects, genuinely listened to the answers, occasionally incorporated my perspective in ways he'd never credit, but that I could track in the decisions he made afterward. In those early months, being with Marcus felt like a genuine partnership. Two people moving through the world at the same level, bringing different things to the same table. Here is what I didn't understand yet. Marcus didn't love my competence. He loved what my competence reflected back onto him. A successful woman on his arm said something about Marcus. It elevated his brand. I wasn't a partner in those moments. I was a feature. I didn't understand that distinction at 28. I was beginning to understand it at 29. The first cracks were small enough that I could talk myself out of them. Marcus had a way, when we were with his inner circle, of slightly adjusting his treatment of me. The introduction would become my fiancée Amelia, with a significant pause where my professional life used to be. My opinions in group conversations would be heard and then gently redirected. When I said something genuinely astute, Marcus would nod and then restate it 2 minutes later in slightly different words and accept the credit. In those private moments, I'd gone from brilliant fiancé to babe. My work had gone from consulting firm to your little business. The shrinkage was so gradual that I kept second-guessing my own perception, telling myself I was being overly sensitive, telling myself every couple has different public and private registers. Then came the Pavlova. It was a Sunday afternoon in winter, which on the Gold Coast means the temperature drops to something actually pleasant, and everyone acts like it's a crisis. We'd driven out to Broad Beach to have lunch at Marcus's mother's house. I'd volunteered to bring dessert because I genuinely liked his mother Margaret, and I wanted to make a good impression on her home ground, away from restaurants and dressed-up occasions where everyone's performing for everyone else. I spent Saturday afternoon making a pavlova from scratch. If you've never made a proper pavlova, let me tell you, it is not a casual undertaking. You separate the eggs at room temperature, and you whip the whites until you can hold the bowl upside down and nothing moves. And then you fold in the sugar so carefully that the whole mixture stays light. And you shape it and dry it in the oven at low heat for hours and hours. And then you pile fresh cream and fruit on top, and it looks like something that belongs on the cover of a cookbook and tastes like a concentrated act of care. I spent $340 on ingredients. The strawberries alone were $20 because I wanted the good ones. I made it with attention that I'd normally reserve for a major client proposal. When I brought it to Margaret's dining table that Sunday afternoon, it was perfect. Domed and ivory white, cream cloud thick, passion fruit and strawberry arranged the way I'd seen in the magazine I'd used for reference. Marcus's brother Darren looked at it and said, "Did you make this or buy it?" There was a beat of silence. I opened my mouth to answer, and Marcus laughed. He laughed the way you laugh at a child who's done something endearingly pointless, and he said, "Does it matter? She'll learn eventually." I sat very still. The dining room was suddenly too bright, too warm, the voices around the table continuing as if nothing had happened, as if those 5 words hadn't just landed on me like something physical. Margaret reached across and patted my hand. "Don't worry, dear," she said, in the soothing tone of someone managing a minor embarrassment. "You're pretty enough that cooking doesn't really matter." I smiled. I cut the pavlova and served it and accepted compliments on how good it tasted. I laughed at appropriate moments and refilled people's glasses and played my role in the Sunday lunch tableau perfectly. No one watching that table would have seen anything but a pleasant family afternoon. But something had shifted. Something internal, precise, irreversible. On the drive home, Marcus put his hand on my knee the way he always did, automatic and comfortable, and talked about a development deal his firm was pursuing in Helensvale. I listened and asked questions and contributed nothing of what I was actually thinking, which was this. He'd done it so naturally. The dismissal, the laugh, the 5 words that reduced 3 years of professional competence and 2 hours of careful cooking to a punchline. He hadn't even noticed he was doing it. Which meant it wasn't a bad day or a thoughtless moment. It was the baseline. That night, after Marcus fell asleep, I lay in the dark for a long time and asked myself the hardest question. Not what had happened, not whether it was real, but this. What would Marcus be like if I actually had nothing? The question arrived fully formed, and I could not unknow it. I'd been watching the public version of Marcus versus the private version. I'd been watching the performance versus the default. But I hadn't yet seen what happened when the circumstances changed fundamentally. When there was no career, no income, no competence to perform alongside. When the calculation tipped entirely in his direction. What kind of man was Marcus when he held all the power? I needed to know. Not because I was already planning to leave. I genuinely wasn't. Not that night. I needed to know because I was 29 years old and 8 months away from a wedding, and I understood instinctively the way you understand something true in your body before your mind has finished the argument, that the answer to that question was the only thing that mattered. 3 days later, I had coffee with my best friend Sophie at a cafe in Main Beach, the kind of place with white walls and excellent cold brew, and a view of the waterway that makes everything feel slightly more manageable. Sophie Chen had been my closest friend since we'd worked at the same firm 6 years earlier, before I went out on my own, and she pivoted into digital marketing. She was sharp and practical and had zero patience for what she called romantic mythology, which was her term for believing the person you loved was fundamentally different from the evidence. I told her what I was thinking, all of it, the pavlova, the laugh, the question that wouldn't leave me alone. I'm going to make myself vulnerable, I said, completely dependent. I'm going to see what he does when he thinks I have nothing to offer him anymore. Sophie looked at me over her coffee cup for a long, measuring moment. That is either the smartest or the most insane thing I've ever heard you say, she said. Help me do it anyway. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, Okay, what do you need? Sophie leaned back in her chair and looked at me with the specific expression she reserves for ideas she considers both brilliant and dangerous. It is a particular look. One eyebrow slightly elevated, coffee cup held in both hands, head tilted fractionally to the right. I'd been seeing that look for 6 years, and I knew what it meant. She wasn't going to tell me not to do it. She was going to help me do it properly or not at all. Okay, she said again, more slowly this time. But first, what's your exit point? At what moment do you stop? I hadn't framed it that way, but the question was exactly right. When I have enough to know, with certainty. Either that I was wrong, that the Pavlova moment was an aberration and I'm about to apologize to a good man, or that I was right, in which case I'll need to know how right. And how long does that take? 3 months, I said. Enough to get through different kinds of situations. Professional events, family, money, everyday routine. Enough to see multiple registers. She nodded and turned the coffee cup in her hands. Second thing, what if you do this and discover he's decent? What does that do to you? Because you'll have spent 3 months performing vulnerability in your own relationship. That doesn't come for free. I'd thought about this. Then I tell him. I explain what happened and why I needed to know. And I deal with whatever comes from that conversation. He might not forgive you for it. I know. Even if everything you saw is exactly what you think it is, even if he's everything you suspect, this will change how you know yourself. You'll be a person who did this. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the laugh, the 5 words. The particular quality of a dismissal so natural it didn't even require a moment's consideration. I'm already a person who stayed in a relationship where this was happening, I said. That changes you too. At least this way I'm choosing the terms. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the cafe, a water taxi moved across the canal, cutting a clean white line through the green surface. A group of teenagers walked past on the boardwalk, one of them laughing at something on a phone, unaware of anything in the world except that one thing. "All right," Sophie said finally. "What I'm going to need is complete visibility. You tell me everything, real time, not after the fact, real time. I need to be able to pull you out if something goes wrong." "Agreed. And if this gets to a point where you want to end it early, if something happens that changes the calculation, we stop. No pushing through for the sake of completion. You say the word, and we stop." "Agreed." "And when it's over," she said, "whatever the outcome, we drink an extraordinary amount of wine, and you tell me the whole thing from beginning to end without leaving out a single detail." I smiled, my first genuine smile in 3 days. Done. We sat there for another hour, working through the architecture of it, the fake business failure, the documents I'd need, the plausibility of the collapse, how to structure the finances so nothing would be trackable. Sophie had a meticulous mind and an instinct for the places a plan could fracture, and between us we found every weakness and built around it. She made me articulate my success criteria out loud, which forced a precision I hadn't yet applied. She made me describe the worst-case version of every scenario. She asked who else knew about our relationship status, who Marcus might call to verify things, whether there was anyone in our shared professional circle who could inadvertently expose the real business structure. By the time we left the cafe, I had a clear operational framework and a partner who understood every element of it. The sun was lower when we walked out, the water catching the late afternoon light at a different angle. Everything turned to the warm gold that this city does in the hour before sunset. I walked to my car with my keys in my hand and thought, 47 days of preparation, beginning now. What I needed was a collapse that would hold up to scrutiny. Not a dramatic implosion, but a slow, credible unraveling that any business owner watching the market would recognize as possible. I spent 2 weeks planning it with the same rigor I'd use for a major project, because in a sense, it was exactly that. A project with a clear objective, defined success criteria, and a finite timeline. Here's what I actually did. I registered an LLC under Sophie's name and transferred my 3 main client contracts into it, restructuring the arrangements as subcontracting agreements that kept my work continuous but made it invisible to anyone looking at my original business entity. I moved $184 of operating capital into a separate account that Marcus had no knowledge of. I filed the paperwork for a suspended ABN and posted a series of carefully crafted LinkedIn updates about difficult market conditions and reassessing direction, and grateful for the lessons. I updated my status to seeking opportunities. I let my professional social media go quiet, and then I told Marcus. I arranged it on a Thursday evening. I made sure I was already upset when he arrived home, sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open, actual financial statements visible on screen, statements I'd specifically designed to show losses of $127. I'd been crying for about 20 minutes before he walked in, which was long enough that my face had that genuine, blotchy quality that doesn't come from performance. He came in and saw me, and his face shifted from the default neutral of a man who's been thinking about his own day into something that looked, in that moment, exactly like concern. He sat down beside me and put his arm around me and asked what was wrong, and I told him. The business, the contracts that had fallen through, the losses, the realization that I'd made mistakes I couldn't recover from quickly. I let all of it out, the way you do when you've been holding something and the pressure finally exceeds what you can contain. Marcus held me while I cried. He said, "We'll get through this together." He said, "You don't need to worry about money." He said all of it softly and with what appeared to be complete sincerity. And for a moment, holding on to that, I felt something that I will not call hope, but that lived in the same neighborhood. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe this was who he actually was. Maybe the Pavlova afternoon was the aberration, and this was the truth. Then he said, "Maybe this is a blessing. You've been so stressed. Maybe now you can focus on planning the wedding and eventually, being a mum." And there it was, delivered so gently, wrapped in so much warmth, that it almost didn't register as what it was. But I had trained myself to listen past the tone and hear the content, so I heard it. The business stress, the career, the independent professional life I'd built for myself. These were obstacles, burdens, things standing between me and my proper function. A blessing, he'd called it. The collapse of something I'd built with 3 years of early mornings and late nights and real intellectual effort was, according to Marcus, possibly a blessing. I pressed my face against his shoulder so he wouldn't see what had moved through my expression. The test period lasted 89 days. I kept a document that I updated every morning, logging interactions, recording exact quotes, noting the date and context of each entry. By the end, that document was 63 pages long. Here is a representative selection of what I found. Before my business failed, Marcus and I split restaurant bills roughly even. We averaged about $180 per dinner date, paid half and half, neither of us making it into a statement. After I became financially dependent, he paid for everything, which sounds generous until you understand how he paid for it. The sighing when the check arrived, the suggestions of cheaper venues, places we'd never have gone before, delivered in the thoughtful tone of someone managing a shared budget. The time I ordered an appetizer because I was hungry and he said, "Really? You're that hungry?" with a slight pause on the "really" that contained multitudes. He was keeping score. I could feel it in every transaction, the invisible ledger he was running in his head, the accumulating balance of what I owed him. Before my business failed, Marcus introduced me at professional events with context, who I was, what I did, what I'd accomplished. After, I became my fiancée. She's between jobs right now. The phrase "between jobs" delivered with a specific intonation that placed it in the category of character evaluation, not circumstances. At a property developer's mixer in Surfer's Paradise, 3 separate people asked me within a single evening if I'd ever considered getting into real estate, which meant Marcus had been talking about my career situation in ways that framed it as a deficiency requiring guidance. Before my business failed, we had genuine conversations. Marcus would ask about my projects, listen to the answers, engage with the substance. After, I became ambient. He would come home and walk past me as if I weren't quite fully present, a piece of furniture he didn't need to acknowledge. He'd spend entire dinners on his phone. Once, I spoke for 40 minutes about a job interview I'd attended, one I'd arranged specifically as part of my cover story, but had prepared for so thoroughly that it had actually gone quite well. And when I finished, Marcus looked up from his phone and said, "Sorry, what?" He hadn't registered a single word. 40 minutes, not even a cursory performance of attention. The warmth was still there, but it was conditional now in a way I could quantify. When I was useful to him, when I was helping plan his work events, when I was looking appropriate beside him at charity fundraisers, when I was the attentive and presentable partner that his image required, Marcus was affectionate, inclusive, generous with his attention. When I wasn't serving a function in his immediate environment, I ceased to exist at a meaningful level. The affection switched on when he needed me and went dark when he didn't, as automatic and unsentimental as a motion sensor light. I need to give you specific examples because "he became a different person" is the kind of statement that demands evidence, and evidence is what this story is built on. Week 3 of the operation. I had mentioned gently that I might have a contact who could help with a venue for Marcus's work Christmas function. His firm hosted an annual event for clients and partners, and I'd worked with an events coordinator at one of the Gold Coast's better hotel properties, the kind of contact that takes years to cultivate and often saves 15% on a venue cost. I mentioned it once, quietly, in the way I had trained myself to offer things during the operation. Marcus thanked me, said he'd look into it, and then booked the venue himself through his PA without mentioning it again. 2 weeks later, at the function, He introduced me to the events coordinator I'd connected him to, the woman whose name I'd given him, whose card I'd passed to him in our kitchen, as someone I'd been dealing with for years. The coordinator looked at me with the brief, polite smile of someone who doesn't recognize me, because Marcus had made the booking directly and I had never been made part of the conversation. He hadn't even done it deliberately. That was the thing. It wasn't a calculated erasure. It was a complete unawareness that what he'd used was mine. You cannot argue with unawareness. There is nothing to grip. Week 5. We were at his firm's quarterly drinks event, the kind of gathering with name tags and canapes and conversations about yield curves that either interest you or don't. I had attended several of these before my business failed, and I remembered clearly how I'd moved through them. With the authority of someone who knew the material, who could match the technical language, who could hold her own in conversations with people who measured each other by professional standing. The new version, the dependent, grateful version, attended the same event in a different register. I stayed near Marcus. I deferred questions to him. When someone asked my opinion about a rezoning decision that was affecting several projects in the Northern Corridor, an area I knew well, had consulted on 2 projects there, I said, "Oh, you'd be better off asking Marcus about the details." And Marcus, who had never worked that corridor and whose knowledge of the specifics was considerably less than mine, provided an answer that was partially correct and partially confident guesswork. I watched him do it and I felt the particular nausea of watching someone claim a territory that was yours. The woman who had asked the question looked at me afterward with a flicker of something. Not pity exactly, more like mild bewilderment, the expression of someone recalibrating a first impression downward, and then turned back to Marcus with full engagement. I had handed her over completely, and she had accepted the reassignment without noticing it. I wrote it down that night. Date, context, exact exchange. Week 6, the money. This one was quieter and in some ways harder to document because it accumulated in individual moments that were each individually deniable. But the pattern was legible from a certain distance. When I needed groceries, Marcus would transfer what he estimated was the right amount. Not generous enough to be purely charitable, not mean enough to be clearly controlled, just slightly less than comfortable, enough that I was frequently doing small calculations in my head about what was reasonable to buy. When I bought the wrong wine for a dinner party he'd invited people to, he mentioned it once, gently, as though offering instruction. We usually do something in the 30 to 40 range for guests we're trying to impress. The we that included him setting the standard and me learning to meet it. He was not being cruel. He was being instructive. That, I had come to understand, was much harder to argue with than cruelty. You cannot say, "You were instructive to me," and have it land the way "you were cruel to me" lands. But the effect is the same. You become smaller, and you do it yourself. I went back over my notes from the first month of our relationship, the months before the engagement, and looked at how he'd spoken then versus how he spoke now. The vocabulary was nearly identical. The intonation had changed. Before, warmth plus engagement. Now, warmth plus management. 2 notes different, and the whole song becomes something else entirely. I documented all of it. Date, quote, context, my assessment of what it revealed. And I kept waiting for the thing I told myself I was looking for. Some moment of genuine decency that would complicate my growing understanding of who Marcus was. Some evidence that I'd been wrong or uncharitable or too precise in my analysis. It didn't come. What came instead was week 7. I need you to understand what I felt when I first opened those WhatsApp messages, because it was not a single emotion and it did not arrive in a clean sequence. It came all at once, layered and simultaneous, a cold clarity, a deep nausea, a particular kind of grief that comes not from losing something, but from realizing it was never what you thought it was. I'm describing the feeling because it matters. The feeling is the whole point. Sophie had connected me to Rebecca Marsh through a careful series of introductions that never revealed what we were actually doing. Rebecca was Colin's wife of 6 years, a former interior designer who'd quietly stopped working when Colin decided he preferred her available. Sophie had noticed at various social events that Rebecca had the specific careful quality of someone who had been managing their own presentation for a very long time. When Sophie finally had a direct conversation with her, Rebecca said almost immediately that she'd been suspicious of Colin's phone for months. She said it the way you say something you've been carrying alone for too long and are finally setting down somewhere. Sophie gave her my number. Rebecca called me herself. The call lasted 47 minutes. I know because I was watching the timer on my phone, tracking it the way you track something important that you are afraid to lose. Rebecca's voice had a particular quality I recognized immediately. The deliberate, measured tone of someone who has been practicing how to say something difficult for a long time and is finally saying it out loud. She didn't make small talk. She identified herself, confirmed she understood who I was and that Sophie had vouched for me, and then said, "I need to understand what you're doing before I say anything else. What is it you're actually looking for?" I told her, the truth plainly, without softening it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Colin and Marcus are very close." "I know. If this is about Marcus, it involves Colin." "Yes." Another pause, longer. I waited without filling it, which is a skill I'd had to develop in my professional life, and which served me well here. Some silences are thinking silences, and some are deciding silences, and you have to let them complete themselves. "I've suspected something was wrong for over a year," she said finally. "He locks his phone. He's always locked his phone, but it changed. How he did it changed about 2 years ago. There's a difference between privacy and concealment, and I know which one I've been living with." Her voice was precise and controlled, and underneath it I could hear the shape of the emotion she was containing. Not crying. Something more sustained than that. I stopped asking questions about a year ago because the explanations he gave me made me feel like I was being paranoid, and I decided it was better to feel nothing than to feel crazy. I wrote that down afterward. I stopped asking questions because the explanations made me feel paranoid. It was the mechanism described with perfect accuracy, the self-doubt engineered as a feature, not a consequence. "I can tell you what I know," I said, "and then you can decide what you want to do." She said yes, and I told her. She got access to Colin's WhatsApp through a method I won't detail here, except to say that it involved a phone backup and technical assistance from a cousin of Rebecca's who worked in IT. The legalities are complicated, and I'm aware of that. What I can tell you is that what we found was not manufactured, and it was not ambiguous. The group was called Ball and Chain Council. There were 847 messages going back 4 years. I read them at Sophie's kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon while she sat across from me and watched my face. I read them in order, starting from the beginning, which meant starting from the moment the group had been created, which was 3 months after Marcus had started dating a woman named Jessie, who was not me, who I knew only as a name in Marcus's history, but who I now understood had been his first subject. They rated their partner's usefulness on a scale of 1 to 10. The categories included physical presentation, social performance, emotional compliance, and what they called independence level, which they wanted in a specific range, high enough to look good but low enough to ensure the partner didn't feel genuinely autonomous. They shared strategies, detailed, specific, practical strategies for what they called managing women who got too independent. Financial strategies. How to structure shared finances so your partner had access to spending money but not to the underlying capital, creating an experience of generosity while maintaining control. Social strategies. How to gently reframe your partner's professional accomplishments as secondary to your shared life. How to introduce uncertainty about their career in ways that increased their dependence on your approval. They called it training. They called their partners investments. James had written a post in month 14 of the group's operation that I found myself reading 4 times because I needed to confirm I was understanding it correctly. It was actually titled, as if it were a professional memo. Recalibration after major pushback. It was over 800 words long. It described in structured paragraphs the tactics he'd used when his then-girlfriend Claire had gone independent after a promotion at her firm. The independence had lasted, he reported, approximately 3 months before his approach had reset the dynamic. He listed his methods with the clinical specificity of a technical manual. 2 of them, reading them in Sophie's kitchen that afternoon, I recognized. I had lived inside them without knowing their name. Colin's responses to that post were detailed and appreciative, in the tone of colleagues reviewing good work. He had additions to suggest, refinements, a variant he'd tried with Rebecca that had achieved similar results faster. He described his approach with precision and without any apparent awareness that what he was documenting was the systematic psychological diminishment of a person he had promised to love. Marcus had replied with, "Amelia might need this when we're closer to the wedding. She's been getting more assertive lately." And then a laughing emoji, getting more assertive. As if my natural self, the self that had built a business and managed client relationships and occasionally disagreed with him about things, was a behavioral problem he was monitoring for escalation. Sophie watched me read that message, and I looked up at her, and she looked back at me without saying anything. Because there was nothing to say that the message had not already said. And then I found the message I'd been building toward without knowing I was looking for it. Marcus had written, "Amelia's business tanked, honestly relieved, was getting tired of her thinking she was on my level." I read that sentence once, I read it again. I set Sophie's phone down on the table and looked at the wall for a moment that stretched. Was getting tired of her thinking she was on my level. There are sentences that function as keys. They unlock doors you didn't know you'd been standing in front of. This was one of those sentences. Everything I'd half understood, everything I'd been documenting, every moment I'd second-guessed my own perception because surely I was being too sensitive or too precise or too uncharitable, all of it resolved instantly into total clarity. The entire 14 months of our relationship rearranged itself around this sentence, and suddenly every piece was exactly where it belonged. Darren had replied within 4 minutes. Now she'll be grateful instead of entitled. Perfect timing before the wedding. I sat with that for a long time. Grateful instead of entitled. As if my professional competence and my independent opinions had been a form of entitlement that required correction. As if the right version of me was one that had been brought to appropriate heel before the wedding, properly reshaped into something that would function within the architecture they'd all designed. I kept reading. Colin had a specialty in financial control. He'd written elaborate clinical posts about allowance structures that feel generous but maintain dependency. He wrote about the importance of making sure your partner's self-esteem is tied to your approval rather than their own achievements. James had contributed a thread about confidence calibration, keeping your partner secure enough to be pleasant but uncertain enough to be careful. 4 years, 847 messages. Not an accident, not a bad night, not a moment of cruelty that a good person regrets in the morning. A system. A deliberate, coordinated, maintained system designed to ensure that the women in their lives would be too financially and emotionally entangled to leave, too uncertain of themselves to demand better, too dependent on the approval of men who had engineered that dependence. I had 8 weeks until the wedding. I want to tell you what those 8 weeks felt like from the inside, because I think it matters for understanding what came next. The first 3 days after reading the messages, I did something unexpected. I slept. Not the difficult, interrupted sleep of someone in crisis, but deep, complete, uninterrupted sleep that I hadn't had in months. I think this is because, at some level, resolution feels more restful than uncertainty. I had been uncertain for months, half knowing and half not, The cognitive dissonance of loving someone while accumulating evidence against them, burning through energy I hadn't realized I was spending. And now the uncertainty was resolved. The evidence was complete. What remained was only the question of what to do with it. Sophie said, "Do you want to just leave? Clean exit? No drama? Move on?" She said it without pressure, genuinely offering the option. I thought about it seriously. I sat with it for a full day, and I decided no, not for the reasons you might expect, not primarily for revenge, though I will not pretend that satisfaction was entirely absent from my planning. Not because I wanted Marcus to suffer in some specific extended way, but because what he and Colin and Darren and James had built was not a personal system. It was a collaborative one, with tools and strategies and a 4-year running record. And the women they were doing it to, Rebecca, Simone, and whoever came after us, deserved to have it made visible. Visibility was the one thing their system had been designed to prevent entirely. Private accountability dissolves. It gets reframed, minimized, rewritten by the person who holds the most narrative power. Marcus would have told any private version of this story from a position of strength, and I would have become the unstable ex-fiancé with trust issues. Public accountability has witnesses. It has documentation. It is much harder to revise when 32 people share the memory of it. So I planned not just to leave, but to leave in a way that would make revision impossible. I also want to tell you that during those 8 weeks, I continued doing everything Marcus expected of me. I woke up beside him. I made coffee. I attended his events. I helped him draft a presentation for a client pitch using my actual skills, the full version, though he never noticed that my contributions were suddenly crisper and more technically precise than they'd been in the previous 2 months. I did all of this with the specific, deliberate attention of someone who has already made a final decision and is simply completing the necessary steps before executing it. There is a particular freedom in that position. When the decision is made, the anxiety lifts. What's left is just the work. I began planning my reveal with the same precision they'd used to plan our subjugation. And if there's an irony in that parallel, I want you to sit with it. The first thing I did was complete the documentation. Every message saved, every receipt organized, the 63-page log of my 89-day operation formatted and dated and time-stamped. Sophie helped me build a timeline that laid out the facts in a sequence clear enough that anyone could follow it without needing me to interpret. I wanted the documentation to be so clean and thorough that no one could question the record, even if they wanted to question my character. The second thing was the stage. I told Marcus I wanted to throw a thank you dinner for everyone who'd supported us through my difficult time. He received this idea exactly the way I knew he would, with a warmth that was genuine in the wrong direction. This was proof of what he'd been working toward. I was being appropriately grateful. I was performing the emotional register he'd been calibrating me toward for 3 months. He said it was a wonderful idea. He said it showed real maturity, and when he said it, the condescension was so pure and so complete that I had to look down at the table to keep it off my face. I booked a private dining room at a restaurant in Broadbeach Waters, the kind of place with good wine and views of the canal and enough formality that people take the occasion seriously. I put together a guest list of 32 people, Marcus's family, his business partners and their partners, our wedding party, and several of Marcus's major clients who I knew by name and face and whose presence at a public reckoning would have professional consequences. Marcus thought I was spending his money on the dinner. That assumption told me everything about how completely he'd accepted his version of me. I transferred $1,400 from my still very active business account. Every dollar of that evening was mine. I arranged the photograph with the detective's visit the previous week. The motion sensor camera had captured Colin on the 3rd visit. Marcus had sent him twice before that, apparently, but Colin had stayed further from the house, and the camera's angle hadn't caught his face clearly. The 3rd time, Colin had walked all the way to the back fence, phone in hand, taking what appeared to be photos of my windows, and the camera had caught him in full illumination. I'd filed the report with the police the same morning. Not because I expected the legal consequences to be significant, I was realistic about that, but because I needed Detective Graham to show up at my door with that photograph at a moment that I could use. The night of the dinner, I got ready with a specific intentionality. I wore the pale pink dress Marcus had bought me in month 2 of the operation, the one he'd chosen because it was modest and feminine and soft, the dress that said grateful and manageable in a visual language he understood perfectly. I wore my hair the way he liked it, down and simple. I wore the engagement ring. I went through every element of my appearance and confirmed that nothing about it suggested what was coming, because the distance between what I looked like and what I was about to do was itself a kind of argument. Evidence performed. The drive to the restaurant was ordinary. Marcus was in a good mood, relaxed, talking about a property deal in Robina that was close to closing. He reached across and took my hand at a red light in the way he did sometimes, the automatic, intimate gesture that I had once found purely reassuring and now understood was part of a texture he maintained. I watched the Gold Coast moving past the windows, the canal houses, the palm trees, the early evening sky starting to deepen toward indigo, and felt the particular stillness of someone who has made a decision and is waiting for the moment to execute it. We arrived. The room filled. I watched Marcus move through his people with the ease of a man in his natural habitat, shaking hands, laughing at the right moments, guiding conversations with the invisible skill of someone who has built a social life so thoroughly around his own image that maintaining it feels effortless. I watched Colin's wife, Rebecca, move through the room with her careful, practiced quality. And I watched Rebecca and I exchange a glance across the tables that no one else would have been able to read. I watched Marcus's mother, Margaret, settle into her chair, and Darren bring his girlfriend Simone a drink with a proprietary confidence she didn't appear to notice. I watched James's girlfriend, whose name was Chloe, look genuinely happy to be there, and felt a brief, sharp pang for her because she didn't know yet. I played my role through the first course, quiet, warm, appreciative, asking thoughtful questions about other people's lives, deflecting attention from myself with the humble social posture that had become second nature over 89 days. I watched Marcus watching me with satisfaction, and I thought, look how well I've trained. Look how perfectly I've learned. Halfway through dinner, when the table had reached that particular state of loosened warmth that comes with good wine and good food and the belief that nothing unexpected is about to happen, I stood up. I picked up my wine glass. Around the table, people looked up with the expectant, pleasant expression of someone waiting for a toast. Marcus looked up at me with the encouraging smile of a man who has no idea what comes next. I took one breath, and then something changed in my body. A settling, a realignment, like a key turning in a lock. The careful softness I'd been wearing for 89 days fell away, not dramatically, not with any visible gesture, but in the way that a mask falls when there's no longer any reason to hold it in place. My voice dropped half an octave. The soft, questioning inflection I'd spent 3 months cultivating disappeared entirely. In its place was the tone I use in boardroom negotiations, the measured certainty that comes from knowing exactly what you're saying and exactly why. The voice that had closed $2, $3 million in contracts. The voice Marcus hadn't heard since the night I'd sat at the kitchen table with fake financial statements and cried on his shoulder. It was the sound of myself. I want to tell you all a story, I said. The room went quiet. Not from what I'd said, the words were ordinary enough, but from how I'd said them. I watched the shift happen in Marcus's face, the encouraging smile faltering, then steadying, something uncertain moving behind his eyes. He'd heard this voice. He remembered what it belonged to. 89 days ago, I said, I made myself vulnerable to see what would happen. I pretended my business had failed. I pretended to be dependent, inexperienced, grateful for guidance. I looked at Marcus directly and let the silence after that sentence fill the room. And I learned exactly who you are. the particular quality of that silence. 32 people, and not one of them moved. I felt it the way you feel weather, something atmospheric and significant. Marcus said, "Amelia, what are you—" "I'm not finished." My voice never rose. There was no anger in it, no heat, nothing that gave him the option of framing this as emotional instability. Controlled precision is so much more devastating than screaming. You cannot dismiss precision, you can only receive it. "For 89 days, I said, I documented how you treated someone you believed had nothing to offer you, how you went from partner to patron, how you loved me when I was useful and tolerated me when I wasn't, how you suggested that my business failing was a blessing." I paused on that word and watched it register in the room. Because now I could focus on planning the wedding and being a mum. His exact words. Marcus's jaw tightened. I could see him calculating, assessing his options, trying to identify which response minimized damage. He was a smart man. He just hadn't accounted for the amount of preparation I'd done. I pulled out my phone and opened the screenshots I'd prepared. I also documented the WhatsApp group you share with Colin, Darren, and James. I looked around the table at those 3 men, watched each of them receive the mention of the group in their own way. Colin went still with the particular stillness of someone who has just realized the floor is gone. Darren flushed a deep, unhealthy red. James looked at me and then immediately looked at the table. The group called Ball and Chain Council. I let that name sit in the air of the dining room and watched what it did to the faces of the women around the table. Chloe, James's girlfriend, had been smiling a minute before, the loose, relaxed smile of someone who has had enough wine to find a dinner party genuinely pleasant. And when she heard the name, the smile did not disappear all at once. It left in stages, like a tide going out. First, the openness closed. Then came the stillness. Then came a focus that I recognized as the expression of someone processing information that is not immediately going to be okay. She turned to look at James, very slowly, and he was already looking at the table with the particular concentrated attention of someone who has decided the tablecloth is the most interesting thing in the room. Margaret, Marcus's mother, sat very straight in her chair. Her expression was difficult to read at first, and then I understood what I was looking at. It was the expression of a woman who knows her son and is therefore not, in the most essential way, surprised. Not performing surprise. Not shocked into blankness. Something more complicated and more honest than that. Something that suggested she had been looking away from certain things for a long time and was now, in this dining room with 32 witnesses, being asked to stop. Simone, Darren's girlfriend, who'd been quiet and polished all evening, moving through the conversation with the practiced social grace of someone who has learned to navigate this world without disturbing it, reached for her water glass and took a slow drink with both hands wrapped around the glass. Not because she was thirsty, but because she needed something to hold. I noted all of this, not with the clinical detachment of the 89-day operation, that mode had lifted the moment I stood up from the table, but with the acute awareness of someone who has spent 3 months learning to read the space between what people say and what they feel. These were women who had loved men and were learning, in a room with good food and inadequate warning, exactly what those men had thought about that love. The one where you rate your partner's usefulness. The one where you share strategies for keeping us dependent. The one where Marcus wrote, and here I looked at him directly, held his gaze, and did not look away. That he was, quote, getting tired of her thinking she was on my level. Rebecca Marsh, sitting 3 seats down from her husband, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. I watched her face and saw the particular expression of someone receiving confirmation of something they have been afraid to confirm. Marcus pushed back from the table and stood. "This is insane. You hacked my phone, you—" "I didn't hack anything," I said, and the calm in my voice was not performed. I was genuinely calm. I had been building toward this moment for the better part of 3 months, and I was ready for every version of his response. Colin's wife, Rebecca, gave me access when I told her what I suspected. It turns out she'd been suspicious for months. I looked at Rebecca, who sat motionless, staring at her husband with an expression I recognized as the moment before a decision crystallizes. I imagine the 1-847 messages going back 4 years were useful context. The number landed, 1-847 messages, 4 years, specific, documented, irrefutable. Colin said, "Rebecca." "Don't," Rebecca said. Her voice was quiet and completely certain. I continued, "I also want to show you this." I opened the photograph. Detective Graham's copy, printed clearly, the timestamp in white digits in the corner. 2:17 a.m. Colin's face, fully illuminated, phone in hand, standing at my back fence in the middle of the night. "This is Colin," I said, "in my backyard 16 nights ago. Marcus was supposedly at a conference in Brisbane. He sent Colin to check on me because he wanted to confirm I was actually home alone. Because you'd all apparently convinced yourselves that the women you'd systematically kept dependent were nevertheless not to be trusted." I paused. The irony of that particular combination of beliefs will take you a while to fully absorb, I think. "I reported a prowler 3 weeks ago," I continued. "The detective came to my door this morning with this photograph and asked if I recognized the man. I told him I did, and I told him exactly why he was there. Surveilling your partner without consent is a crime in Queensland." I looked at Marcus. "As is accessing someone's phone records without authorization, which is what you directed Colin to do. The detective has my full statement." The silence that followed had a different quality than the silence before. The first silence had been surprised. This one was reckoning. I could feel 32 people processing, recalibrating, updating their understanding of everything they thought they'd known about the relationships at this table. I watched Marcus. I want to describe this carefully because I spent a great deal of time thinking about this moment beforehand, building toward it, and I want to do justice to what it actually was. His face cycled through something complex. The initial sharp calculation of a man who handles crises professionally. Then a flicker of what looked almost like genuine appeal, the face of someone looking for a door that isn't there. And then, settling into something that was harder to watch, a kind of collapse. Not dramatic. Nothing fell or shattered. But his certainty left him. The particular quality he had of occupying a room that assured physical ease of a man in his territory visibly drained. He stood at the table looking at 32 people who were looking back at him, and for the first time in the 14 months I'd known him, Marcus didn't know what to do. I spoke again, and I want you to hear my voice as I heard it. Steady, not unkind, but without a single degree of mercy. "You said to your friends that I should be grateful instead of entitled. Here is the truth. I was never entitled. I was your equal. But you couldn't tolerate equality, so you waited for a moment of weakness to reshape me into something more manageable. You didn't want a partner. You wanted an accessory that was too dependent to notice what it was." I reached down and picked up my engagement ring, the $8,700 ring, the one he'd shown me the receipt for to establish how much he'd invested. I set it on the table in front of him, carefully, as if placing a period at the end of a long sentence. "My business never failed," I said. "I moved it into a separate structure and kept working throughout. I made $184 dollars in the 3 months you thought I was broke." I watched that number move through the room. "I bought this dinner tonight. I paid for the detective's time, and tomorrow I'm moving out of your apartment, which I have been paying half the rent on for 11 months, including the 3 months during which you believed I was destitute." Marcus opened his mouth. Nothing came out. There was genuinely nothing available to him. Every argument, every reframe, every version of his response had been forestalled. I had thought of all of them in advance, and the documentation made them irrelevant. What remained was just the plain architecture of what he'd done, visible now to everyone. "You all pretended to be partners," I said, looking around the table one final time, letting my gaze land briefly on Colin, Darren, James, on their faces and on the faces of their partners. While systematically ensuring that the women who loved you would be too dependent to leave, you thought you were being clever. I let that sit. You were just cruel, and now everyone in this room knows it. I picked up my purse. Sophie was already standing, 3 seats down, with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting for exactly this moment and is prepared to find it satisfying. As we walked toward the door, I stopped at the threshold. I turned back. I had one more thing, and I delivered it in the same unhurried, certain tone I'd used for the entire speech. "Oh, and Marcus, the wedding is canceled. You'll receive my official statement tomorrow through council. All $31,000 in deposits were in my name, and I began the cancellation process this morning. You wanted someone grateful and manageable." I looked at him one last time. This man I had once loved, this man who had looked at my vulnerability and seen opportunity. "I suggest you find someone who's interested in the position." I walked out. The Gold Coast night was warm, and the air smelled of salt and the particular subtropical richness that comes after a day of sun. Sophie walked beside me, and when we reached the street, she said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it honestly. "Like myself," I said. Behind us, through the restaurant's glass walls, I could see the room in motion. Rebecca had thrown her wine in Colin's face. I didn't see it happen, but Sophie told me later, and I have replayed that image in my mind with considerable satisfaction. James's girlfriend Chloe had stood up from the table and walked out through a different exit without a word to anyone. Darren's face had apparently achieved a color that Sophie described as a medical situation. Marcus's mother was very still in her chair, with the expression of someone who has understood something she would have preferred not to understand. I had prepared myself to feel triumphant. What I actually felt was something quieter than that. A specific kind of relief that comes when a long task is finally complete. A settling. The particular clarity of having seen a thing fully and responded to it proportionally. We drove home through Surfer's Paradise, and I watched the city lights on the water, and I thought about the woman who'd sat at this same kitchen table 11 weeks ago, deciding to begin. She'd been hurt and clear-eyed and patient in a way she hadn't known she was capable of. I felt something toward her that wasn't quite pride, but was in the same family. The aftermath came quickly and in waves. Rebecca filed for divorce 6 days after the dinner. She called me the week after to tell me, and her voice had that specific quality of someone who is frightened and certain in equal measure. The combination of emotions that marks the beginning of a difficult and necessary thing. I told her I had full copies of everything, and they were available to her at any time. She said, "I've been making myself smaller for 6 years, and I didn't even have a name for what was happening." I didn't say anything to that because I didn't need to. She already had the words. Darren's girlfriend Simone moved out the same week. I didn't know Simone well, had spent time with her mostly at group dinners, where she'd been quiet in a way I now understood differently. But I heard later that she'd called a family member from the restaurant that night and had a place to stay by morning. The social consequences moved through Gold Coast property development circles with the particular velocity of information in a professional community that is actually quite small. Within 48 hours, the basic facts were known. Within a week, the details had traveled through the layers of that world with the efficiency of water finding level. I heard different versions of the story repeated back to me at different points, and the core was always the same. A woman had spent 3 months undercover in her own relationship, documented systematic manipulation, and delivered a public reckoning. 3 of Marcus's major clients pulled their contracts in the 2 weeks following the dinner. A development partnership he'd been cultivating for months went silent. His firm didn't collapse. These things rarely happen that cleanly, but the damage was real and professional and directly connected to what he'd done. His mother stopped speaking to him, which I suspect hurt him in ways that the professional consequences didn't. What I heard, through Margaret herself, she sent me a brief, Formal note, 3 weeks after the dinner, handwritten on notepaper, which I found both unexpected and not entirely surprising, was that she had driven home that night and spent 2 hours at her kitchen table going through her memory of the previous 14 months, with the specific retroactive clarity that comes when you finally understand something you'd previously refused to see. She had heard Marcus say, "She'll learn eventually," over my pavlova, and she had managed it, excused it, fitted it into a narrative of harmless thoughtlessness rather than a governing philosophy. The note said, in part, "I want you to know that I believed you completely. I also want you to know that I should have seen it sooner." It was one of the more honest things anyone said to me in that entire period, and I wrote back to tell her so. James left the Gold Coast within 2 months. I heard he relocated to Melbourne. Whether that was professional strategy or a more personal kind of flight, I don't know and didn't try to find out. Colin and Rebecca's divorce moved through the courts with the particular grinding efficiency of proceedings that are contested on financial grounds and unambiguous on evidentiary ones. Rebecca's lawyer had the WhatsApp records. They made the financial settlement very clean. Rebecca called me the week she filed to tell me, and her voice had that specific quality of someone who is frightened and certain in equal measure, the combination of emotions that marks the beginning of a difficult and necessary thing. I told her I had full copies of everything and they were available at any time. She said, "I've been making myself smaller for 6 years, and I didn't even have a name for what was happening." I didn't say anything to that, because I didn't need to. She already had the words. His sister called me. She introduced herself carefully, apologized for the family, and then said, without preamble, "My husband is in a group like that. I've suspected it for 2 years. Do you have copies of the messages?" I told her yes. I told her I would send everything she needed. She said thank you, in a voice that was very steady and very tired, and I understood that she had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was finally putting it down. Marcus reached out 5 times over the following month. The first message was angry. He said I had humiliated him publicly and that my stunt had caused professional and personal damage that I would hear about legally. I forwarded it to my lawyer, who responded to his lawyer, and that was the end of that direction. The second message shifted registers. He said he wanted to explain his perspective and that I had misunderstood the context of certain things. I noticed he didn't specify which things. The third message was something I hadn't anticipated. It was almost philosophical. He said that he had been raised to understand relationships in a particular way and that he recognized in hindsight that some of his behaviors had been unhealthy. He said he thought he might benefit from talking to someone. I read this message twice. I noticed that it was entirely about his inner journey and contained no acknowledgement of any specific harm done to any specific person. The fourth message was pleading. He said he had genuinely loved me, that the things in the group chat didn't represent his real feelings about me, that he wanted a chance to demonstrate who he really was. I sat with this one for a while because there was a version of me, the version from 14 months ago, standing on a restaurant balcony with champagne and a receipt for an engagement ring, who might have wanted to believe it. I thought about what it would mean to accept it. I thought about the 1847 messages. I thought about getting tired of her thinking she was on my level. I thought about whether genuine love and systematic efforts to diminish were things that could coexist in the same person, and I decided that was not my question to answer for him. The fifth message said, he missed me. I blocked him after that, but I saved them all, because the arc of those 5 messages is itself a kind of document. The sequence from anger to philosophy to pleading to missing is the sequence of a person who has been held to account processing what accountability feels like. I found it instructive, not moving. The detective investigation went nowhere legally. Colin claimed he'd been checking on a friend's place, without clear evidence of criminal intent, and with Colin's lawyer characterizing it as a misunderstanding, the matter was closed without charges. I had known this was the likely outcome. The detective's visit had served its purpose before it became legally irrelevant. I had used it the night it arrived, and it had performed exactly the function I needed. As for the legal threat Marcus had made in his first message, nothing came of it. There was nothing to come of it. Everything I had done was documented, deliberate, and defensible. I had not hacked anyone's phone. I had not manufactured evidence. I had watched, listened, recorded, and reported accurately. The truth does not require legal defense. I moved into a beachfront apartment in Surfer's Paradise 2 weeks after the dinner. The apartment had windows on 3 sides, and the mornings were extraordinary. That same pale gold light I'd been watching for months now, filling a space that was entirely mine, with no performance required and no calculation about what I should appear to be. I sat with my coffee in the morning and looked at the water and felt the particular luxury of complete privacy, the luxury of being exactly who you are in your own home without managing how it lands on anyone else. My business expanded by 34% in the quarter following the dinner. I hadn't anticipated that part. What happened was that the story traveled. These things do travel. In the particular informal network of professional women who talk to each other in ways that men underestimate, and women started seeking me out specifically. Not just for consulting work, though there was that, but because they had heard about what I'd done and wanted to talk about it. Some of them had situations that were similar in structure, if different in detail. Some of them just wanted to understand how I'd known, how I'd seen what I was seeing clearly enough to act on it when it would have been easier to explain away. I became, as Sophie put it with considerable amusement, a minor Gold Coast legend. I want to be careful about how I hold that, because I didn't do what I did to become a story. I did it because I needed to know the truth, and having learned it, I needed to respond to it in a way that was proportional and honest and visible. The visibility was deliberate, and I won't pretend otherwise. Part of the design of the reveal was that it happened in public, with witnesses, because private accountability is so much easier to rewrite than public accountability. Marcus and his friends had built their entire system on privacy, on the invisible space between public performance and private reality. The correction needed to happen in the space they'd been using. A year later, I'm sitting on my balcony with the same pale gold morning light, and I'm engaged to someone who knew me during my failed business period and never once treated me differently. Daniel Kim came into my life 6 weeks into the 89-day operation, through a professional connection that had nothing to do with Marcus's circle. He was a landscape architect who worked with developers on sustainable design, occasionally tangential to my consulting work. We met at a professional event and had a conversation that lasted 2 hours past when either of us had planned to stay. He knew me as a woman who was between things. That was the version he got, the soft-voiced, careful version I'd built for the operation. The professional event where we first met was a sustainability forum held at a convention center in Broad Beach, one of those day-long industry gatherings with panel sessions and networking breaks and catering that is always slightly worse than it needs to be. I'd attended as part of my cover story's maintenance. A woman seeking opportunities would plausibly attend industry events, and I'd prepared for it the way I'd prepared for everything in the operation, with complete attention to the character I was performing. Daniel was on a panel about green corridors in urban residential development. I remember being surprised, genuinely surprised, by the precision of his thinking. He didn't use the comfortable vagueness that experts sometimes deploy to maintain authority without committing to positions. He was exact. He cited specific projects, named specific failures, disagreed with another panelist with the calm specificity of someone who had formed his view through direct experience and could therefore be specific about it. During the networking break, he found me at the coffee table and introduced himself directly, which I noted because most people at networking events introduce themselves at an angle, leaving an exit available. He was direct, and he did not perform modest. He said, "I noticed you asking a question in the second session. You seemed like you actually wanted the answer." The question had been about remediation costs in brownfield development, and I had asked it because I had a view about the answer and wanted to test it. Not because I was performing the character. I'd forgotten, for a moment, that I was performing at all. "I did," I said. "I thought the panelist undersold the timeline risk." He looked at me with the alert attention of someone who has just heard an opinion worth examining. "I agree with you. What's your background?" And for the first time in weeks, I had to actually work to stay inside the cover story. Because the cover story didn't have a clean answer to that question. "Consulting," I said. "Feasibility and stakeholder work. I'm between engagements currently." The phrase I'd used dozens of times, smoothed down by repetition. But something in how he received it was different from how everyone else had received it. He didn't file it and move on. He tilted his head fractionally and said, "Between engagements is an interesting way to put it. What were you doing before?" I gave him the narrative. He listened with what I can only describe as careful patience, not polite waiting, but the specific quality of someone genuinely trying to understand, who notices when the pieces don't quite fit and holds that observation without rushing to resolve it. I finished the narrative. He nodded slowly. "You seem very calm about it," he said. "I'm working on that," I said, which was truer than he knew. He asked if I wanted to continue the conversation somewhere quieter. We found 2 chairs near the edge of the room and talked for another hour about nothing related to what I was actually doing, and by the time we left, I had agreed to coffee the following week. On the drive home, performing no role for no audience, I thought about the difference between a conversation that manages you and a conversation that notices you. I had spent 3 months having the former with Marcus. An hour with Daniel had given me the latter, and I hadn't been looking for it. He asked about my work with the curiosity of someone who is genuinely interested, and when I described the difficult market conditions narrative, he listened and then asked questions that were precise enough that I had to work to stay inside my cover story. He asked things like, what specifically did the cash flow look like? And which client category was most affected? And when I gave him the rehearsed vague answers, I watched him notice the vagueness with the patient expression of someone who is waiting to understand something that doesn't quite add up yet. He never pushed. He never confronted. He just kept paying careful attention. We had coffee twice during that period, and once he said, almost offhandedly, "I notice you're very thoughtful about how you talk about your business, like you're being precise about something." He said it with genuine curiosity, no pressure in it, just an observation offered openly. I said something deflecting, and he accepted it completely and moved on. After the dinner, about 3 weeks after, I told him the truth, all of it, from the beginning. I had not planned to tell him because I hadn't been sure yet what we were to each other, but the situation seemed to require honesty, and I gave it, sitting at a coffee shop in Mermaid Beach with the full story laid out in its chronological sequence. He was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then he said, "I wondered if something else was going on. You didn't seem like someone whose business would just collapse." That sentence, the simplicity of it, the respect in it. He had seen the inconsistency, and instead of exploiting it or dismissing it or trying to manage it, he had simply paid closer attention, held the question open, waited. That is the difference. That is the whole difference, distilled to its simplest form. Marcus saw vulnerability as an opening. When he believed I had nothing, his instinct was to widen the gap, to consolidate the advantage, to ensure the distance between us would hold. Daniel saw inconsistency as a reason to look more carefully. When something didn't add up, his response was curiosity, not calculation. I didn't need to test Daniel. But when I eventually told him about the operation, and he sat with it, and the thing he said in response was that he'd already suspected something more complex was happening, I understood that the test was irrelevant because he would have passed anyway. Not because he's perfect, but because his instinct toward the people he cares about is to understand them more fully, not to manage them more efficiently. That is not a small thing. I want to say that plainly. After everything I'd documented, after 847 messages and 89 days, and the full detailed architecture of what Marcus and his friends had built, the contrast is not subtle. It is the difference between someone who sees you as a resource to be optimized and someone who sees you as a person to be known. I kept score. I always was. And what the score showed me, in the end, was not just who Marcus was. It showed me what I was actually looking for. What equality in a relationship feels and looks and sounds like when it's real. What it means to be known rather than managed, seen rather than assessed, present rather than decorative. The Gold Coast moves through seasons in its particular way, subtle and warm. The winter's almost indistinguishable from spring, except for a slight softening of the light. A year out from the dinner, my life looks very different from what Marcus had been constructing it toward. It is larger. It is mine. The morning light still comes in that particular pale gold shade, and I still drink my coffee at the window watching it. But what I feel watching it now is not anticipation of a test. It is something simpler and more durable than that. It is just the ongoing, ordinary pleasure of being exactly who you are in your own life, with no performance required. Here is what I want you to take from this story, because I think it goes beyond one woman and one bad relationship. Research on intimate partner dynamics consistently shows that control in relationships rarely begins with dramatic cruelty. It begins with small recalibrations. A slight diminishment here, a gentle redirect there, the gradual shrinkage of someone's sense of their own competence until they begin to police themselves without external pressure. Psychologists call this coercive control, and studies from relationship researchers at the University of Queensland and elsewhere indicate that one of its most effective mechanisms is financial and social dependency, specifically the kind engineered slowly enough that the person inside it rarely has a clear moment of recognition. What makes Marcus and his friends unusual is not what they were doing. It is that they were doing it consciously, systematically, and collaboratively, with language and strategy and a 4-year running dialogue about technique. Most coercive control operates on instinct shaped by culture, not explicit design. Theirs had documentation, but the psychological mechanism is the same. They were exploiting the normal human tendency to trust the people we love. When someone you love begins to slightly reshape your self-perception, you extend the benefit of the doubt. You assume good faith. You explain away the evidence because the alternative, that the person who proposed to you is systematically diminishing you, is an unbearable conclusion. The protection is not cynicism. The protection is clarity. The ability to observe what is actually happening rather than what you have been led to believe is happening. The capacity to hold the question, who is this person, when the performance is off and the power differential is wide? Marcus's answer to that question was documented in 847 messages. The documentation was a gift, in a way. Most people have to infer the answer from texture and instinct and gradual accumulation of moments that don't quite add up. The messages made it legible. The operation made it irrefutable. Trust the clear evidence of who someone is in unguarded moments. When someone shows you who they are when they think nothing is at stake, believe them completely. The version of yourself they are comfortable diminishing is the version they are comfortable with permanently. You deserve someone who finds it genuinely inconceivable to diminish you at all. If this story landed for you the way it was meant to, please hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who need to hear exactly this kind of story. And it takes you 2 seconds. In the comments, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to see someone clearly before you could let them go? Have you ever known in your body that something was wrong before you could put words to it? Tell me where you're watching from, too. Gold Coast? Sydney? I want to know who's in this community, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now. This channel is built on stories like this one, stories about people who found clarity when it mattered, who held their ground, who kept score when the people around them assumed no one was. The video playing next on your screen right now is one I almost didn't make. It involves a family inheritance, a forged document, and a woman who found a second copy of a will in the last place anyone thought to look. It is one of the most extraordinary stories I have covered on this channel, and I promise you the ending will stay with you for days. Watch it next. You will not regret it.